Hi, welcome back to Grains in Small Places, and today I wanted to talk to you about the 3 most common mistakes or problems that you might have making yeast bread with fresh milled flour. So let's get started. If you're new to working with fresh milled flour, you might have noticed that it's a little bit different than working with white flour. So if you are an experienced baker that's been baking for 20, 30, 40 plus years, and you automatically then switch to using fresh milled flour, sometimes that transition is the hardest for you. So the experienced bakers that have all the tried and true methods that you've learned over the years of how the dough looks, how the dough acts, how the dough feels, is just a little bit different when working with fresh milled flour. So I'm going to share with you 3 of the most common problems that I see when people ask me questions and things while making bread with fresh milled flour. I'm also going to share a couple little bonus tips at the end, that some other problems that I see often. So the first thing I want to go over is the kind of wheat that you're using. So to make bread, whether it be yeasted bread or sourdough bread, you really want a stretchy, nice dough. So you're looking for that gluten development. The stretchiness is caused by the gluten development. So you really need to make bread with mostly hard wheat, whether that be hard white wheat or hard red wheat. You can throw in a small percentage of other kinds of wheat or ancient grains or rye or soft white or anything like that. You can throw a little bit in with the hard wheat as long as your majority, like say 80%, is hard wheat. Now, yes, there are some recipes out there made with like 100% einkorn, 100% kamut. In fact, I do have a 100% kamut bread recipe I can put a link in the description box below, so if you're interested in that. Now, with those breads, you're not going to get that nice, squishy, soft, stretchy dough, soft loaf like maybe you're used to with white flour or sandwich bread from the store. Those breads that you're making with ancient grains or different wheats that are not the hard wheats are going to be a little bit more dense. They're still great bread. There's still good recipes out there, but they're not going to give you those results of that fluffy, soft, squishy bread. I do have tons of recipes for fresh milled flour on my blog at grainsinsmallplaces.net. I'll put a link to that down in the description box below. Recipes all over the place, from breads to cookies to brownies to puff pastry, croissants, you name it. I probably have it, and if I don't have it yet, I'm probably working on it or it's on my list. So I really like to reach out and get some different recipes out there. Okay, so now that we've talked about the wheat variety, which is the first problem that I see, let's go into the second problem. So the second problem that I see is too dry of dough or too much flour added. So when you're working with fresh milled flour, you really need a wet dough. And the number one comment I get on almost all of my recipes is my dough is too wet or my dough is too sticky. That's actually a good thing because fresh milled flour needs a much longer time to absorb the liquid. So from the time you start your recipe to the time that your first rise is over, that fresh milled flour is still absorbing liquid. So you really, if you're starting out with a dry dough right at the beginning, it's only going to get drier. So the whole method where everybody with white flour will give you that nice trick where you just keep putting flour in until it doesn't stick to the sides of the bowl, it doesn't really work great with fresh milled flour. If you do that, you're probably going to end up with dough that is too dry. If the dough is too dry, it's going to be dense. You're never going to develop the window pane or that nice stretchy dough. I do have some videos on the window pane if you're interested, but basically all that is a way to describe nice stretchy dough. You don't have to get the dough all the way to a window pane every time. In fact, it's not always possible to get super thin if your wheat variety is low in protein or just not that great of a harvest that year, so the gluten development is a little bit less than what it might be. I have noticed with using many different kinds of hard wheats, some of them will develop gluten much faster than others. So it's always important to make sure that you're looking, feeling, and touching your dough and stretching it to see how your dough is acting rather than looking at the time on the clock. Because if I give you a time of how long to knead it, for person A, it may be under kneaded and they still need to knead longer. For person B, it might be over kneaded and the dough is already, the gluten development has gone past its stretch and now it's turned into like a liquid gloppy mess, which is no really good way to save that. You could maybe make crackers or something like that with it, but once it gets to the over kneaded stage, it doesn't make a great loaf of bread. So breadcrumbs, crackers, something like that. Don't worry, you don't have to throw it away. You can always make those things with it. So you really need to be working with a wetter dough than you might think. So I get a lot of messages about people that have tried making bread with fresh mode flour, and then it ends up not turning out. And then I explain to them, or I kind of help them along the way with their kneading process. And when they see that transformation in front of their eyes, it's just like magical. So the first time that I saw it transform, I was like, oh, this is perfect. This is what I need. It made the dough so stretchy and beautiful, and it made the most delicious, soft, squishy sandwich bread. And that kind of sparked this whole thing to keep experimenting, trying, figuring out what we could do to get this bread to be more like what my family was used to with sandwich bread before we started eating fresh mode flour bread. So that second tip, working with a wet dough, is definitely key to getting your fresh mode flour bread light, fluffy, airy, squishy, all of that. That's not to say that there's not a place for a bread that's a little bit denser. Sometimes I'm looking for a heartier bread or a denser bread to hold up to a sandwich, or just, bread and butter. There's room for all sorts of breads out there with all sorts of textures. But if you're looking for that soft, squishy bread, that's what this is applying towards. So that brings us into number 3. So the third problem that I see is usually under kneading the dough. So one trick you can do, if you have a mixer that you feel is being overworked or overmixed, you can always mix it for a little bit, let the mixer sit and rest, mix it for a little bit, let it rest, and so on and so forth until you get the stretchy dough that you're looking for. If you're pressed for time, you can always do a longer, what I call an autolyze. It's not technically an autolyze because an autolyze is with just water and flour. I do share a lot of these methods in a blog post called the GISP method. Those are just some methods that I have developed over the years, just figuring out things. I will put a link to that blog post in the description box below. It gives you a bunch of tips on the autolyzing, the window pane, and all kinds of things. Kind of like a study guide partner to this video. So that little autolyze trick I was talking about, if you do that longer before you put your yeast in, the reason I hold the yeast out is because when I put my yeast in for the autolyze, that activates my yeast right away and it's ready to go. If I have to run errands, do laundry, forget about it, take care of the kids, anything like that you might be needing, I love to keep the yeast out because that autolyze I can leave for 15 minutes. I could forget about it and leave it for an hour or 2 hours and go along with my day. So it just fits better into some schedules. It may not fit into your schedule that way, but I just find that it gives me the grace to forget about it or run an errand or do something like that. Then when I get back or am ready to go, I can put that yeast in and then start the kneading process. And I start that kneading process, then my yeast has been activated and I know that I have this certain amount of time because I don't want to overproof my dough. So just make sure when you're in the beginning, if you have a new batch of wheat that you haven't worked with, a new mixer, a new recipe, anything like that, just make sure that you're watching your dough as you go. Just stop it, pull it out, get your hands wet. It makes it less sticky. Get your hands a little wet and then stretch it, see what you have. Sometimes you might need to go to different parts of the dough while you're stretching. So that way you can check for the stretchiness. If your dough has started to get nice and stretchy, I would just stop it there because it will continue to develop a little bit of gluten because time is your friend. As time goes by, gluten can develop still. That's why those no-knead bread, overnight breads, which I do have a recipe for one of those no-knead overnight breads on my blog as well. So with the kneading, With my old KitchenAid mixer, I would knead the dough for 20 to 30 minutes almost every time. Then I got my little Bosch Compact, and that shortened my kneading time to maybe 18 to 22 minutes, a little bit. Then we tried out that Nutrimil Artiste mixer, and that really shortened my kneading time to like 8 minutes. And then I got the Ank mixer, which you've seen me use many times, I'm sure, if you've been watching my channel for a while. So my Ankerswim mixer is the one that I have currently. I still have my little Bosch Compact. I use it for small jobs. Sometimes I still have my KitchenAid because I use that for my pasta maker and my meat grinder and all those little attachments that I already have. But the Ankerswim mixer, it kneads the dough in such a gentle way that sometimes it still may take 20 minutes to get a window pane or the gluten development. But with my new batch of wheat, I've been finding that after I do an autolyze, I'm only having to knead for 7 to 8 minutes. So I think it's more important with the wheat that you have than the mixer, but the mixer is important to note that yours might be a little bit different. All of these mixers, I've used the same recipes and the same wheats and all of those things. So I can tell a little bit easier about how to compare them. So it's important to note that those kneading times will vary greatly depending on the recipe, the mixer, and your wheat berries. So just make sure that you're there, watching it, feeling it, touching it, knowing how long to go. Also, another thing that affects it is the weather outside. I will find that if it's super rainy or humid, that sometimes my kneading times and my dough doesn't come together like normal. On dry days, I will sometimes have to add more liquid. So just touching and feeling and stretching your dough is the best way to tell if your dough is properly kneaded. I do have a short little video on under kneaded dough, over kneaded dough, and perfectly kneaded dough. It's just one of those little YouTube shorts, and that shows you kind of what the dough looks like in those various stages. So those are the top 3 things. I told you I'd share some bonus things. One of the bonus things is over kneading the dough. So I have seen that some people, especially with the Bosch and Nutrimil Artiste mixers, those mixers knead so quickly that they develop the gluten much faster. And that's a great thing. But I found that that's also a downside when you're learning because sometimes it will over knead the dough because it kneads it so quickly, which means you have a short window to where it over kneads. Whereas some of the gentler mixers out there take much longer to over knead the dough and you won't have that big of a problem. But the same thing that makes the Bosch a great mixer also when you're learning can make it a little bit more difficult. So over kneading the dough can be an issue as well. And once the dough, like I was saying earlier, is over kneaded, you can't really get that gluten structure back. So another problem I see kind of piggybacks off of the wet dough and adding the more flour in. I find that sometimes people will make their recipe, think that it looks too wet, and then after they've been kneading the dough for 10 or 15 minutes, then they'll add more flour. And then they'll start kneading the dough again. But that creates a new problem in and of itself because now we have dough that is either perfectly kneaded or almost perfectly kneaded. Now we have new flour put in there that's not been kneaded at all. So by the time the new flour is ready and stretchy, the old flour has been over kneaded. So really try to get that amount of flour right at the very beginning before you've been kneading for a long period of time. I find that I very, very rarely need to add more flour. If anything, I more commonly will sprinkle in some extra liquid. So if you've been kneading your dough for 20 minutes and it's a dough ball just going around and around and you're like, it's not developing the window pane, I can tell you right now, you probably need to add liquid. It will never develop the window pane if it's like a dry dough ball, which the dry dough ball is what you're normally looking for with white flour. But with fresh milled flour, you really probably are going to need to add some more liquid. And then another problem I see is the yeast. So most of my recipes call for instant yeast. You can still use active dry yeast, but sometimes you have to take that active dry yeast and use some of the liquid from one of my recipes, activate it with a pinch of sugar, and then let it sit for like 10 or 15 minutes, which is generally during that autolyze period. And then I'll say put in the yeast. When I'm putting in my yeast, you can dump that whole mixture in. So you can use active dry yeast. You just have to go about it just a little bit differently. But you also want to make sure that your yeast is still good and valid. So you can test your yeast by taking a little bit of your yeast with some water and a pinch of sugar and let it sit for 10 or 15 minutes. It should get nice and foamy. If it's nice and foamy, you're good to go. It's happy yeast and ready to raise some bread for you. If it doesn't get nice and foamy, then there's probably an issue with your yeast and you may want to discard that and get some new yeast. One more bonus tip is overproofing or underproofing. So overproofing is when we let our bread rise too much, or for too long. Basically what happens is the yeast is rising this bread and then it uses almost all of its resources and then it's just exhausted. And when you put it in the oven, it just has nothing else to give. So it can't rise your bread anymore. And what will happen is it will deflate. So the number one cause of deflated bread is usually overproofing. Sometimes it's caused by underbaking. So bake it a little longer or proof it a little bit shorter. So let that second rise time be a little bit shorter. Underproofing generally will give you a dense bread result. Those splits on the side that you'll get sometimes, because it's only risen a little bit and in the oven it'll do an extra rise and it'll want to rise so quick because it wasn't quite proofed all the way. Now that bread generally is still perfectly fine to eat. In fact, when I'm in a hurry, a lot of times my bread will look like that because I know that it's still going to be nice, good, and delicious. It just won't be as pretty on the side. I'd rather err on the side of a little bit underproofed than a little bit overproofed, because overproofed it's going to deflate and then it'll be kind of dense and gummy. And the last one I want to share with you is underbaking or even overbaking. So overbaking can cause your bread to be very dry and crumbly. Another cause for dry and crumbly bread is too much flour added. But underbaking can cause also, I was mentioning before, the deflation in your bread while it's cooling, or a little gummy center. It can cause that as well. So the best way to avoid underbaking your bread is to use a little digital thermometer. I just use this meat thermometer. It has a magnet on the back and it hangs on my refrigerator. I could put a link to this in the description box below. I'll also put a link to my mixer, my mill, and all of those things when I get questions about like my grain bins and stuff like that. That way you can check those out. But this is nice to have. It's an instant read, so it's very quick. You want to make sure that you're putting this into the center of the loaf. So you don't want to just temp the edges or the ends. It wants to be, you want to check in the middle, the center of the center, as best as you can get without burning yourself, of the loaf. You want to make sure for yeast breads, it's at least 190 degrees Fahrenheit. 195 is probably better, but at least 190 degrees Fahrenheit. For sourdough, you're probably going to want something closer from 205 degrees Fahrenheit to 210 degrees Fahrenheit to ensure that you don't have that gummy texture at the end. Also, slicing too early can cause the doughy, gummy texture as well. So I hope this video was valuable to you. Let me know down in the comments below if you've had any of these problems. Let me know if there's any further problems that you're having that I can help you with. I can try and answer the questions in the comments. If you've got something that you're stumped and you can't figure out what's going on, I can try my best to help. Sometimes I get very little information. It'll be like a picture of bread and then say, what happened? So sometimes I'm trying to like diagnose it, or like the dough whisperer or something like that. But I'll try my best to help you, because my goal is truly to help you have success with your fresh milled flour breads. So don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with your friends. And thanks for stopping by Grains in Small Places. Goodbye.